Go ahead, Martha.
Welcome everyone to House of Ruth and Junia and our Bible study. And we are continuing in the book of Deuteronomy. We're kind of moving around in different ways in this book. Jetty put together chapter 25, which we didn't get to last week, and we will cover it tonight. But in doing my reading and studying, there were some other things I wanted to bring up or mention that I think help to make a context for what Deuteronomy is. I think the Jews consider Deuteronomy in some ways to be the most important of the 5 books in the Pentateuch. And it stands in the middle of what their scholars call Judaism becoming a religion of the book. And it was men of the book, their priests, their rabbis, and people of the book, the written law, and the other part of their tradition was the wisdom tradition, which we're going to have a good time when we get there, because I really love that. But the Deuteronomic tradition shows up in more books than just Deuteronomy. We will see it again in Jeremiah, in Baruch, and some of it was found in Exodus as well. And one of the Christian scholars who's very good as far as Old Testament, Walter Brueggemann, has said that this was an extremely important book, that it underscores the tradition of the writings of the law and the canonical formation for the Jewish faith. But he said it should not be understood as just a fixed scroll, because it continues to go on being interpreted and reinterpreted, which is characteristic of Judaism. They have these ways of thinking about it and articulating it and going on with ongoing interpretation. And even within the book, as we saw a little bit last week, there are refinements made in how some of the thinking is presented. And Brueggemann says, old memories are endlessly represented and reinterpreted and re-articulated and reimagined in ways that keep the main claims of faith pertinent and authoritative in new circumstances. So he feels that's really the essence of Judaism as it has evolved. And there were some other sources I looked at too that I wanted to share. Let me get into my Kindle. I used the Jewish Study Bible to take a look at what they were saying, so we have a Jewish source other than Robert Alter. And the Jewish Study Bible is done by their organizational group, and is more of a group project, you might say, than Robert Alter is a single scholar that has translated and interpreted it. And they all, that probably this Deuteronomic core was well established by the 7th century BCE. But there were some changes that happened, and I found this interesting. Deuteronomy was translated into Greek for the Jewish community in Alexandria. And the Greek version was done about 225 BCE, a couple hundred years before Jesus. And they were relying on that. The book that was in Greek relied on, and in a sense updated, the Hebrew in light of its own time. So there was this evolution that was occurring, even though if we look at it casually and quickly, it still just looks like a bunch of laws. But it really isn't. There have been changes. They say that the Greek text or the Dead Sea Scrolls might open a window into the original meaning of a passage that was lost in the Hebrew text that was being used. And because the Greek text was accepted by the church, it often was not recognized that it really was a Jewish translation. And it was prepared for a thriving Jewish community in Alexandria. And it was not a Christian translation. Definitely was a Jewish work. And they gave an example of how the Hebrew talks about the horror of foreign invasion as punishment for the nation's sins. And then by the time it gets into the Greek, it's reinterpreted as punishment as the contemporary experience of diaspora, or moving away, moving out. It was seen more, you left the fold, kind of thing. And also, the text is very much dealing with the problem between divine revelation and human interpretation. So at many points in Deuteronomy, laws are being reinterpreted. And we picked out what was really a very, very mundane chapter out of Deuteronomy. The book covers all sorts of legal situation. There's a whole legal corpus that covers all of the obligations of Jews, and such things as how you handle debts and how you handle slaves and sacrifices and the festival calendar and the laws for public officials and so on. But this one chapter, 25, falls in the middle of what the Jewish Study Bible says is kind of a miscellaneous criminal, civil, and family laws. And I chose it because it covers some interesting family issues and how they dealt with these situations in the family. And I think that if you read Robert Alter's endnotes, in a sense, it will seem less harsh than you might get out of it if you read it just verbatim. It's not a long chapter, but it starts with when people are being punished for something they've done wrong, they would be thrashed with a whip. And the rule was, don't give them more than 39 lashes if they've been assigned 40. You wanted to make sure you didn't do more than what was legally mandated. And the other thing is, if someone showed signs of expiring or great distress, it was stopped. It was stopped. They didn't go any further with that. And we also have an interesting little verse in here, verse 4, where we note that they're paying attention to their animals. And we tend to think about sacrificing all these animals. Well, the method of sacrifice was done to be the least traumatic to the animal, even though it sounds to us very gory and bad. But it reads, you shall not muzzle an ox when it threshes. The ox is threshing the grain. And in other words, if the animal stops to eat some of the grain, and that's okay, you should not stop that. You shouldn't prevent the animal from having the food he needs. So then it comes to the whole issue of what was later termed Levirate marriage. That if a woman's husband died, she was supposed to become the wife of her deceased husband's brother, one of the brothers, who would then have a child by her, and the firstborn would be considered the dead husband's child. You got to remember, at this point, they really don't have a concept of the afterlife. What they believed was your memory would be carried on through your children. So if a man died without an heir, then for all intents and purposes, he would not be remembered. So she would be taken by one of the brothers. But of course, this came to be a big issue. What if she doesn't want to or he doesn't want to? And so they had rules. If the brother didn't want to, or if she didn't want to. Now flash to the book of Ruth, where Ruth comes into the community and is accepted in the community. And there are relatives of Ruth. They're not a brother, they're actually distant relatives. And they could beg off, and they did beg off. So it really was not a hard and fast thing. It was an attempt to take care of women who have been abandoned or left, either divorced or the husband died. But in this case, there were avenues for the woman or for the man who did not want to marry. And I thought this was a funny kind of story here. The man that refuses in the city gates, verse 10, the man that refused, so he's not going to get the heir of his brother, and his name shall be called in Israel the house of the slipped off sandal, because she would approach him in front of the elders and slip his sandal off. And the text says, and spit in his face. The altar says, is mainly spitting on the ground in front of him, as what they would do. And then he would be called the house of the slipped off sandal. I love it so much. There that I have to figure out, make him get that into, use that somewhere, because I like it so much. The house of the slipped off sandal. A guy who's just not going to take responsibility for his deceased brother. But then it has another story there. Should men brawl together, a man and his brother, and the wife of one of them come forward to rescue her man from the hand of the one striking him, she reach out her hand and seize his pudenda. You shall cut off her hand, your eye will not spare her. Well, apparently it's not as draconian or severe as the text would seem to mention. What the rabbis did with that was to interpret it differently, that she would be owed monetary compensation. It was a breach of modesty on the part of the woman, but if she inflicts serious injury, he said that she might grab his testicles. If there was an impairment of his functioning, then this was somehow linked to the concern for continuation in the Levirate marriage. So apparently things were not exactly as prim and proper as we might imagine. If you can imagine a woman grabbing a guy that way, or his sandal off and spitting on the ground in front of him, we don't get an impression of women that are passive little creatures who are helpless in the face of what is going on with the men. I find that very interesting.
Yeah.
To be some of it seems to me in some ways they hold their own. It's not kind of the impression that I was raised with. The men had these different wives, and the wives just had to do what the men told them to do. And that it was a very tight pecking order. It really doesn't seem when you get into the text, and we're just in one tiny part of the text about these rules and laws, but it's like they have an exception for everything. They have a way out for these things. So that I found very interesting. And of course, the laws and rules are going on and still being interpreted and reinterpreted. I've been following an email series on the Talmud, which provides reinterpretation of a lot of things, and it will have little stories about, suppose this man wants a divorce. If he does, this is what he's got to do, and if he doesn't do it, it's not valid. And it goes through these little stories of how different rabbis have interpreted that situation over the centuries. So it's really very interesting to see that they had this living process.
Yeah.
It was not like the Ten Commandments got written on 2 tablets in stone and were never considered or restudied or reinterpreted again.
As some would have us believe.
As I don't know, I know that I grew up with those kind of prejudices about it. And I think that it was not necessarily an intentional prejudice. It was that the people that I was learning from knew very little about the Hebrew Bible or the Hebrew tradition. They did a modicum of study in it, and they interpreted it from an English Bible. And they did not really have a feeling for the tradition itself. You certainly didn't have the idea that you would discuss it and you might have 2 different interpretations, and they're not worried about that. It's okay. You can hold 2 different traditions or interpretations in your mind at the same time. You don't have to discard one simply because it seems to contradict. The next rabbi in line will probably find a way to integrate them or make sense of it. And I feel that we lost so much in Christianity because we lost that process. And so likewise, many of our doctrines did not evolve beyond the 3rd century when they were written down. We do have some Christian traditions that have worked hard to interpret or reinterpret. I'm thinking of the Orthodox have done more with that than anybody else, I think. But for it to be a living document, if you have a creed, how does it become a living document? Can it become a living document? And that's a big question, because we tend to teach people that you memorize it and that's it. And the biblical interpretation is equally well frozen. They don't seem to be doing that here. They go on here to measurement, weight stones, and they are talking about some people, like now, there are some people who have a second set of accounting books. They have one set of accounting books for the IRS and another set of books for themselves. And I guess that would be equivalent of the Hebrew having 2 different sets of weights. Because in this chapter, it's weight stones, a big one and a small one. You shall not have in your house different ephah measures, a big one and a small one. Whole and honest weight stone you shall have. A whole and honest ephah measure you shall have, so you may enjoy length of days on the soil that the Lord is about to give you. You know, in modern terms, we have the guide with the 2 sets of books. Years ago, when I started out in forensic, I had a very brilliant supervisor over in San Bernardino, but he had his 2 sets of books. And I had been set up in such a way that I would make very little money, very little. And then one day a private case came through that I was taking for a lawsuit of the state board that got hurt. And my supervisor said, well, they'll not pay more than $200 for that evaluation. And I said, it's not doable for $200. I can't do it for that. I'm going to ask for $500. He said, oh no, you can't do that. You'll have to just take $200. Well, I went to the law office and they wrote me a check for $500 and didn't bat an eye. And it dawned on me that he'd been all along with me, that I had been working for peanuts, but that was not my purpose there. I still worked at Biola teaching, but I realized I was being cheated, and I was much more careful about things to try to make sure I wasn't after that. Ultimately, he got arrested for having his finger in the pill with Medi-Cal, lying about what he was doing in patients, and ended up in very hot water, about which time I left San Bernardino. I was done. I was not going to hang around there anymore. But we have the same problem back in 700 BCE. You shall not have in your pouch different weight stones, a big one and a small one. And the reasoning given, if you do that, you will not enjoy length of days on the soil that the Lord is about to give you. It was a promise for the future. Remember, in Deuteronomy, they weren't there yet. They were not in the promised land yet.
Yeah.
And then finally, in this chapter, it talks about fraud. Well, we all know what fraud is. We're having many living examples of it on television these days.
Oh, yes.
We only have to look to our ex-president to understand how fraud works when you've made a career of fraud. And it will, it looks like, we hope that what goes around will come around.
Yeah.
But here, the abhorrence of the Lord your God is anyone who does all these things, who commits any fraud. So he, in the text, asked them to remember what had been done to them when they came out of Egypt, and to remember how they were treated. And remembering how you were treated, you will be more willing to be merciful to those that you're dealing with. The whole thing about Amalek, I did not know. That was interesting. Alter says that the Amalekites were a semi-nomadic people, and they carried out horrible raids where they killed Israelite settlements. And so they're being reminded that that's what happened to them, and not to do that with other people. And it shall be when the Lord your God grants you respite from all your enemies around in the land that the Lord your God is about to give you, in a state to take hold of it. You know, and you should not remember those atrocities. You should be careful and not commit any fraud. So it is an interesting little chapter about how they reasoned about the rules and what were some of the exceptions they made, and how did they talk about the rules. They didn't do what we have imagined, that it was some cold, hard material that was put before them, and then they that it didn't evolve in their understanding, because it did evolve in their understanding, as hopefully it is evolving in our understanding. I think that from a Hebrew standpoint, there would not have been this idea that it's locked in stone, that their whole culture, you eat it, you chew it, you talk about it, and you may evolve some different meanings for it, and still not abandoning the basic commandment. That was, to me, just a tiny little sample that I thought related more to our daily life now, which is why I chose that very nondescript chapter, because it actually does relate to things that go on now still, even though we don't carry two different weights around in our pocket. Business people do have two sets of books. And some people don't necessarily have a formal set of books, but they figure out, this is what I have to report, and this is what I don't have to report. And I think some of that goes on to a large degree everywhere.
I will point out, as a former tax lawyer, that IRS collection agents, some of them carry guns.
It does.
Yep.
Some of them carry guns. I mean, the IRS, the way the tax law is structured, it's very coercive, and it structures society. If you think through how the tax law works, and that part of the thing about not having two sets of books and not having two sets of wages is part of the way society is constructed. It's the social contract. You just don't do certain things. It's not the social contract. But tax law can reform society in many ways. And I find it interesting here about the Levirate marriage. Did you ever watch the series Deadwood?
Yes,
There was a Levite marriage in it.
there was.
Mhm.
Tell us about it. I don't know it.
Let's see, a brother had a wife, had a son, and he died. And she came to Deadwood and married his brother. And they had a chaste marriage at one point, and then she said we should have a full marriage. In the meantime, she referred to him by his last name, Mr. Bullock. Mr. Bullock.
Oh,
It is very interesting. So I guess that might happen in certain societies.
Yeah,
I can't in my wildest dreams imagine marrying any of my husband's brothers.
not really count.
Thank
You
goodness.
got the good one out of the bunch?
Hmm?
You got the good one out of the bunch?
Oh, yeah, I got the only one that was worth a damn.
Well, that happens too. Literally.
Well, the first one didn't have any brothers, so that wasn't a problem. And the chances of, especially as it played out in reality, chances of the brothers outliving, because I married the baby of 7.
Oh, wow.
So the chances of the brothers outliving him were slim to none.
Yeah. Well, we can imagine ourselves in those situations, but it's kind of hard to place ourselves there.
Yeah.
It feels like, yes, it is more than 2,000 years ago, more like 3,000 years ago, when it was a very different world. But I think the main point out of that is that they were trying to allow the line to survive. And another thing was to take care of widows. So the goals of that.
it was community thinking, to keep it in the community. That was the main goal. And
Yeah.
to be fruitful for them as many kids they could have in that same family. It was very important.
Yeah,
Especially when you think about in the Western world, how even in the last century, how widows have been treated. I mean, it was, they've pretty much been left to fend for themselves, which isn't always
Yeah.
perfect. So marrying the family would be an obligation for the men's family, but a saving grace for the woman.
Mhm.
Yep.
Mhm.
So true.
well, I don't want to leave the book of Deuteronomy without one thing we have not touched on. And that is the most important prayer
Shema.
the Jewish people have. It's called the Shema.
Yeah. Beautiful.
You say it when you're dying. It should be the last thing you say when you die.
That's true. And it's supposed to be said every day.
Right.
So I'm going to read that.
When I was a hospice chaplain, I actually memorized it in Hebrew, but I can't remember now.
I've got it here. Robert Alter's version. And it's beautiful. And they say it daily. Hear Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your being and with all your might. And these words that I charge you today shall be upon your heart. And you shall rehearse them to your sons and speak of them when you sit in your house and when you go on the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. And you shall bind them as a sign on your hand. They shall be as circlets between your eyes. And you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and in your gates. So I think it's very powerful, especially with Hear Israel, Lord our God, Lord one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, with all your might. So I think that it is giving a picture of worship and loving God that is beyond just words. So enters into the relationship, the whole self, and you pass it down to your children, or those that you are some way teaching or responsible for. When you go on the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise, and when you sit in your house, go on the way, when you lie down, and when you rise. So I think it's a very beautiful prayer, central to their worship, their daily worship. Any other thoughts tonight?
No, it's a beautiful prayer.
I find it very interesting that what we came from in a Judeo-Christian way is forgiving and expanding. And where we are now is not, nor is it expanding. I mean, we as individuals, yes, but as a country right now, we are shrinking and not forgiving. This what they are referring to as the Judeo-Christian ethic is a lie. You know?
It's been so distorted in the public view that it's just not even recognizable.
No.
Well, I will point out that the First Amendment provides freedom of religion, freedom for religion, and freedom not to have religion.
Correct.
And one of my pet peeves is when people talk about the founding fathers as if they were Christians. They were not. They were deists. Thomas Jefferson rewrote the New Testament to take out all the miracles of Jesus.
Yeah.
And one of them, I think it was John Adams, was really anti-church. So
Yes.
they're not Christians. They were not.
No.
I really hate when people say, well, we were founded on a Christian ideal. No, we were not.
No, it's not true.
That we were
We were
free to
founded
believe what
on
we
a
wanted.
deal.
We escaped persecution from England.
We were founded on Greek ideal.
Well, you know, they're so focused on the Second Amendment that they forgot about the first. And they even have the Second Amendment wrong.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. But we need to pray for this country.
My mother's maiden name is Anthony, and she is a descendant of Susan B. Anthony's sister.
Oh.
I had a letter when I cleaned out my house. I knew I had it somewhere, but I found it. A letter from Susan B. Anthony to her sister, thanking her for doing the logistics that made Susan B's travels throughout the United States possible.
Wow.
And Radcliffe, I went to Harvard. Radcliffe has a whole library, part of their library devoted to Susan B. Anthony. So I sent that letter.
Wow.
It's an interesting letter.
Oh.
Interesting letter.
Yeah.
You know, thanking her for the logistics. But Susan B. Anthony was a friend of Frederick Douglass, and they were at Seneca
Oh,
Falls
really?
First Women's Convention. They were seated together. And Frederick Douglass was saying that really what needed to happen is that Black men needed to get the vote. And Susan B. Anthony said, no, we've got to get it to white women first. So there was a little tension, but they were seated next to each other at Seneca Falls. And they were friends.
That's very interesting.
As Susan B. Anthony, it was a Quaker family. So the Quakers never condoned slavery or racism.
Well, kids, what we're gonna do next week is do some talking about the Torah overall. You know, to try to grasp what we've gone through. We've only gotten snippets out of each book. I hope we've done some talking about the characteristics of each book, but we'll talk about the Torah as a totality next time and its place, not just in Judaism, but in other faith traditions too. It also plays into Islam, and it plays into Christianity, of course, even though we've been given a very, what I think is a very distorted view of it. It's just been a very dry, and a very dry presentation is how I experienced it. And with this study, it's kind of coming to life more for me to understand scripture was a process in being written, and there were some subtle changes in it over time, and then there were reinterpretations over time. It is not written in stone, and so that's a great comfort, and we can apply it pretty well. The same motivations that existed then to be generous and to help the needy, or keep it for yourself and cheat your fellow man. The same motives are still going on. Nothing has really changed in that regard. So these texts are not out of date.
No.
I don't think they'll ever be out of date.
And that's astounding considering they're thousands of years old.
Yeah, they are. Can you think about human history that would be Deuteronomy 700 BCE, and so you're talking 2,800 years ago, and that was when it was being consolidated. Pieces of it and strands of it obviously came much earlier, but that's when it was being consolidated. But it continued to be consolidated and in some ways reinterpreted, especially after it was translated into Greek, or the Greek language and the Hebrew language do different things with the same concept. And here we are in English or Flemish or Norwegian. Jetty is trying to read the Bible in Norwegian now. You know, and what has been interpreted and gone expanded beautifully the original, or in some cases distorted it. Our friend Jenny Wong, who's Chinese, prefers to read her Bible in Chinese because each of those characters has its own meaning, and the interpretation of it in Chinese is apparently much richer than it is in English.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So she prefers that, and she had this Bible since she was in China, and it fell apart. It's actually fallen apart twice because she's used it so much. I remember when it fell apart the first time, and we had it rebound for her. And then recently, Jetty and I had it rebound for her again. Because she's got other translations, but that's the one she wants.
Yes, it's true.
So hopefully it's strong enough to carry her all the way through now.
I understand. I still have my confirmation Bible and it's still my favorite.
Yeah,
Even though it's King James,
yeah.
it's mine. It's the first Bible I had. Its pages are almost worn out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good, kids. Any other comments before we part?
Mm-mm.
No, we're fine.
Hey,
We shall pray.
Leslie?
Okay. The Lord be with you.
Okay.
And also with you.
And I bless you in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Let us go forth to love and serve God in all God's manifestations with our whole heart, our whole soul, and our whole being. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much.
Thank
you
you,
later.
Martha.
Bye-bye.
Bye,
Bye.
Leslie. Bye, Rebecca. Bye, guys.
Bye, Rebecca.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Rebecca.